The Republican takeover of the American national government in 1801 coincided with increased opportunities for education, literacy, and freedom in American artistic life. In other ways, however, a new national culture began to pose a serious challenge to Republican ideals. In education, Jefferson and his Republicans advocated for an enlightened society by making education compulsory for boys, or mandatory. As Americans placed more and more value on Republican motherhood, women like Judith Sargent Murray wrote and argued for equal educational opportunities for women, the future teachers and mothers of America's political leaders. Republicans also invested in efforts to uplift, quote-unquote, Native Americans by placing them in white schools, though no effort was made to educate enslaved African Americans. The American medical community made a newfound commitment to the scientific method during the early 19th century, despite age-old prejudices and superstitions. Still, patients often had more to fear from their doctors than from their illnesses. Former President George Washington, for instance, died of a minor throat infection in 1799 when his doctor's efforts to bleed and purge him went too far. Over time, the professionalization of the medical field by men pushed women, midwives, entirely from the field. In religious circles, Christian traditionalists in this era were alarmed by new rational religious doctrines, theologies that reflected modern scientific attitudes. Deism, which had originated from French philosophers, advocated for an understanding of a watchmaker God. That is, God created a universe and it ticks along without his influence. Beginning in 1801, traditional religiosity staged a dramatic comeback in a wave of revivalism known as the Second Great Awakening. Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians found success 60 years after the First Great Awakening, presiding over camp meetings and convincing folks to embrace piety, to reject skeptical rationalism, to readmit God and Christ into their daily lives. Again, women comprised the majority of participants. The movement of industrial work out of the home and into factories in this era robbed women of economic opportunities, and religious enthusiasm provided women access to a new and wide range of activities, whether it be charitable societies for orphans or missionary organizations, etc. Black revivalism among slaves created unrest in the South, and the religious conversion of Handsome Lake, a Seneca Indian, inspired a movement against destructive white customs and a revival of traditional Indian ways all across the continent. A global revolution in technology and machinery, often called the Industrial Revolution in retrospect, coincided with America's second religious revival. The American Eli Whitney's cotton engine, or cotton gin, was the principal technological innovation of the era in the United States. As the device made cotton harvesters roughly 8 times more effective, the institution of slavery was emboldened and gripped the South even more tightly. Notably, Eli Whitney's machine also helped introduce the concept of interchangeable parts to U.S. designers and manufacturers. As Robert Fulton's steamboat carried passengers up the Hudson River in 1807, while the first turnpike connected Philadelphia to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. While America was largely still rural, horse racing in cities was an early sign of the vast appetite for popular public entertainments that would be an enduring part of the American culture. The relative unimportance of the federal government during the Jeffersonian era was symbolized by the character of the new national capital, which remained little more than a swampy village. This, of course, is Washington, D.C. Congressmen had no permanent homes in the city, and Jefferson himself did not always bother to dress up to meet visitors to the presidential mansion, the future White House. Though Jefferson was certainly a shrewd and practical politician who used his powers of appointment as an effective political weapon. He had little difficulty winning re-election against his Federalist opponent in 1804. Both Jefferson administrations moved deliberately to reverse the lavish spending of the Federalists Washington and Adams. Jefferson persuaded Congress to abolish all taxes, leaving customs, duties, and the sale of Western lands as sole sources of national income. He reduced the National Army to 2,500 soldiers and the Navy to just 7 ships. Anything but the smallest of standing armies, he argued, might threaten the civil liberties of the American people. And this is that unique sort of Southern agrarian Republican point of view I was talking about. The ability of the Supreme Court to nullify acts of Congress remained in question until this era, but the Supreme Court's Marbury versus Madison decision made the judiciary and the Supreme Court a co-equal branch of government alongside the legislative and the executive. The arcs of United States President Thomas Jefferson and French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, both important advocates of democratic government, coincide during this era. France retained its title to Louisiana, which Napoleon hoped would be the heart of a new French empire in the American continent. Jefferson craftily persuaded Napoleon to sell Louisiana territory back to the United States. Jefferson also commissioned Lewis and Clark's Corps of Discovery to cross the wild continent to the Pacific Ocean, and Zebulon Pike to explore the Mississippi Valley in Colorado. Some Federalists, a group specifically called the Essex Junto, worried that the addition of new states would inevitably weaken the old states of the Union, and they opposed Jefferson's new exploration in the West by threatening secession. Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton, oppositional candidates for the governorship of New York, dueled each other in part over the question of secession of New York State. Burr, who had been accused of treason and now risked murder charges after he shot Hamilton, fled to the West and affiliated himself with a movement to take Mexico from Spain, was captured and acquitted by a Federalist Chief Justice John Marshall. The Burr conspiracy, as it became known, is a symbol of the larger perils still facing the young nation at this moment. A too-weak central government and an abundance of political leaders willing, if necessary, to circumvent normal channels in their quest for power and influence. So even though we've decided on a constitution, what sort of nation we'll be is still very much in flux. Unyielding westward expansion by whites created constant collisions with native populations committed to protecting their lands from intruders. Threatened tribes mobilized to resist white encroachments, and as the Napoleonic Wars between the British and the French escalated in Europe, the Indian conflict in America became intertwined with the European conflict, which soon snowballed together into the War of 1812. In the first years of the 19th century, American commercial ships at sea increasingly found themselves caught between Emperor Napoleon's French decrees and Great Britain's commercial blockade. Most Americans considered the British the worst offender, since British vessels took to stopping American ships and they seized sailors off the decks, making them victims of impressment. It was, at least originally, a legitimate effort to retake British seamen who'd left their floating hell and defected to America's merchant marine navy. But a severe manpower shortage pushed the British Navy to abuse the practice. So this is not that different from the British before the Revolutionary War, when they came to help out with the French and Indian War, when they came and just sort of quartered themselves in colonial homes or forced American colonists to join the fight against the French. The British are sort of bullies, would be a good way to put it, and this policy of impressment is a very good example of British still sort of egging on the colonies, now the United States. Jefferson and Madison tried to maintain peace with Europe by implementing an embargo, which prohibited Americans from leaving the United States by ship for any foreign port. The theory being, let's keep Americans off the seas so that we don't get entwined in this European conflict. While widely evaded, the law was effective enough to create a serious economic depression in the young United States. Days before his term ended, Jefferson approved a bill ending his unpopular experiment with peaceable coercion. James Madison, a Republican, was elected in 1804 with a slim majority and attempted a more moderate embargo that allowed trade and transportation with all nations, Britain and France. But let me say that again. After Madison was elected, he implemented a more moderate embargo that allowed trade and transportation with all nations except Britain and France, the principal nations at war. Indians, with renewed desperation, continued to look to England for protection against American land incursions and harsh removal policies. Jefferson's solution to the quote-unquote Indian problem was to offer Indian peoples a choice: convert themselves into settled farmers and join white society, or migrate permanently west of the Mississippi River. Jefferson and other American leaders considered assimilation a benign alternative to the continuing conflicts on the western frontier. They thought this was a good policy because it would end all these conflicts and all this bloodshed. The British, though, expecting American incursions into Canada as conflicts continued across the Atlantic, renewed their relationships with and began arming native allies. The British partnership coincided with the rise of the Prophet and his brother Tecumseh, whose ascensions convinced Indian nations of their superior virtues and emboldened a political and military alliance bent on halting white American expansion, recovering the Northwest, and making the Ohio River a lasting boundary between the United States and Indian country. By the spring of 1812, the British-Indian alliance was evident. For the first time since the Revolution, Indians renewed coordinated raids on white settlements, terrifying American settlers and stymieing American expansion into British territory. While white frontiersmen in the North demanded the conquest of Canada, those in the South looked to acquire Spanish Florida. The desire for Florida became another motivation for war with Great Britain. Spain was Britain's ally, and a war with England might provide an excuse for taking Spanish as well as British territory. Remember, when Britain left after the Revolutionary, they left the colonies. They didn't leave all their claims to the western lands. So finally, as we're in the 19th century here, white Americans are moving on to Indian lands that are sort of British, and so we're renewing the fight here over western lands. By 1812, war fever was raging in both the northern and southern United States. That sentiment found its support in Washington among a group of young war hawks in Congress, including John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, who pushed President James Madison into authorizing a second war against Great Britain. After Napoleon launched a catastrophic campaign against Russia that left the French in disarray, Great Britain was able to turn its attention back to the American continent, specifically all the lands that whites and Indians were fighting over. The American efforts to invade and take Canada were largely unsuccessful. Andrew Jackson of Tennessee took brutal action against Spanish-backed natives as he pushed his way down the Florida Peninsula. Meanwhile, the British landed near the United States Capitol and set fire to several public buildings, including the White House, on their way toward Baltimore, where the American victory, immortalized in the Star-Spangled Banner, took place. The words of the banner detail the improbability of a second victory against the great British Empire. Most battles in the War of 1812 did not go well for the Americans, though. In New England, opposition to both the war and the Republican government was so extreme that delegates met in Hartford, Connecticut in 1814 to discuss their grievances and consider seceding from the young nation. Andrew Jackson's impressive victory at New Orleans, though, and the reports of a weak peace treaty, signed the Treaty of Ghent, Christmas Eve 1814, quickly squelched the fervor of the secessionists. So now it's the North who doesn't like what's going on because the agrarian South, the Republicans have been in power, sort of authorizing this war. The people of the North don't really want to fight this war, so it's the North who, at least briefly, considers seceding. The British were deeply in debt, and with the defeat of Napoleon, Americans knew the British would no longer have much incentive to continue to interfere with American commerce on the high seas. For the Indian tribes east of the Mississippi, the War of 1812 was another in a series of doomed efforts to resist white expansion. Their intertribal alliance had failed. Their allies, the British, were gone for good. The end of the War of 1812 spurred a new white movement westward that threatened to end the native history on the continent completely.